Hello, hello, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Aidan Meyer, and I am the Central Illinois Outreach Coordinator for Faith in Place. It's so wonderful to be here with all of you for session 4 of the annual Environment and Spirituality Summit. So on behalf of Faith in Place, I want to welcome each of you, whether you are joining us from near or far. We are grateful for your presence and your commitment to these important conversations. As I join you today from Springfield, Illinois, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the land that holds me and all of us in this moment. This is the ancestral homeland of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, and other Indigenous peoples who have long cared for this land with deep wisdom. We honor their enduring relationship with the earth and express our gratitude for the teachings they continue to share. May we reflect on their stewardship as we gather today to explore how we too can live in greater harmony with the earth and with each other. Now, before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsors for making this event possible. So thank you to our Great Lakes sponsor, Presbytery of Chicago, our cardinal sponsors, Illinois Environmental Council, First Presbyterian Church of Columbus, Indiana, and Countryside Church Unitarian Universalist. Our Jacob's Ladder sponsor, Marilyn Antonick, and our Oak sponsors, Delta Institute, Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary, Slipstream, AES Solar, and Elevate. Your support allows us to gather, reflect, and act in ways that contribute to a more just and sustainable future. Today's session will be a rich exploration of kinship, decolonization, and climate justice. We are incredibly fortunate to have Hilary Giovale with us as our speaker. Hilary is an activist, writer, and speaker who is committed to decolonizing white settler culture and supporting transformative change through kinship and relational practices. With roots in the American Southwest, Hilary's work is inspired by her explorations of nonviolent action, peacemaking, and restorative justice. Today, she will guide us in understanding how a concentric approach to the earth can lead to healing and justice, especially in addressing the lasting impacts of colonialism. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our facilitator for today's session, Cindy Shepard, Faith in Place's Green Team Director. So with that, I'll hand it over to Cindy to introduce our speaker and lead this important dialogue. As they're speaking, please feel free to add questions in the chat. We've set aside some time at the end for the Q&As. So thank you again for being here. Cindy?
Thank you so much, Aidan, for that great introduction to this topic today. And thank all of you for being here and joining us. I'm very honored to guide today's conversation with Hilary Giovale, a person whose work has touched so many of us already in our lives. Hilary, it's a pleasure to welcome you, and I'm excited to dive into our conversation today. As a reminder to everyone, one more time, as questions come up, as you hear about things that you'd like to hear a little bit more about, please be sure and put those in the chat so that we can include them in the Q&A at the latter part of the hour. Hilary, such a pleasure to have you here. I'd like to start by just asking you to tell us a little bit about your own journey and what led you to the current work that you do. And we'd like to hear about the experiences and influences that have inspired you to dedicate your work to this field.
Yeah, thank you so much, Cindy. It's so good to be here with all of you today and visit with you from a different part of the country. I'm in what is today called Flagstaff, Arizona, and I'm sitting next to a sacred mountain of kinship that is revered by more than 13 Indigenous nations of this region. And she's right over my left shoulder here. I feel her whenever I'm sitting in this chair, just like a grandmother right next to me. And so this is Dene, Hopi, Havasupai, Pueblo, Apache land, among other nations. And so, you know, really the answer to that question, the first answer is this mountain. I moved here over 30 years ago to go to college, and I had no idea of sacred landscape. I had never heard that term before. I was raised in a very, white middle class way in which that concept was not part of my worldview or my upbringing at all. But since I've been living here and I've made relationships with the indigenous communities around me, they have told me this mountain works on people whether they're aware or not. So she's been working on me for over 30 years. And I credit her with leading me into this work. And I also credit the indigenous communities around me in this region. And I also credit my ancestors, my own ancestors who came from Scotland, Ireland, Germany. I have very ancient, deep ancestry in Scandinavia as well. And, I feel like my ancestors who engaged with this continent, many of them in a way that was not balanced or healthy. I feel like they have been speaking to me and tapping me on the shoulder in my lifetime and asking me to come around and look at the past and speak into and lean into the legacies that they left in order to begin the process of repair. So all of those forces are part of my entry into this work, and I'm just really grateful for all of them. I'm grateful for this land and being able to live here and all the communities surrounding this land and my own ancestors.
Thank you. How interesting to hear how those influences you listened to and they led you on. Fascinating. Could you share about your current writings and work that's your focus now?
Yeah, well, I have a week from today. I have a book coming out. I'm very excited. Here it is. It's called Becoming a Good Relative, Calling White Settlers Toward Truth, Healing, and Repair. And I also have a couple pieces of writing I'm working on currently that I hope will be published someday. But this book is really the focus right now because it's been this labor of love for 9 years. The seeds were planted for this book 9 years ago, and I've been working on it ever since. It's been, it's a very difficult thing to write about. It takes a lot of courage. It's a little bit scary sometimes. I've had many moments of like, really, should I really be writing this book? I don't know. I don't know if this is if I have the capacity to actually talk about this. And I've reached out to many community members and many readers and received tons and tons of feedback. And I'm so grateful that there have been so many people who have been willing to help me and give feedback and help me refine my thinking and help me see my own blind spots. Because that's the thing about writing about this. If you've been acculturated into whiteness like I have, there are many blind spots that we tend to have that we can't, there's certain things that we just can't see on our own. And I've had many mentors and helpers to help me see those things. So that this book, even though my name is on it, and also the foreword was written by Yeye Louis Satish. The closing words were written by a Dene scholar named Lila June Johnston. Even though our names are on it, it has also been nurtured and held by many, many communities that are helping us to bring this forward. So that's the exciting news of the moment for me right now, that it's coming out a week from today. And it's been largely informed by relationships. And so that's where it comes from. It comes from that place of kinship.
I love the subtitle of the book, Calling White Settlers Toward Truth, Repair, and Healing. And it takes a member of that white culture to make that call, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's interesting. The very last reader that I had on the book is a brilliant Black woman who lives in Atlanta. And I did not have that subtitle on there until the very end. And she said to me, we need a subtitle on this book. It needs to be clear who it's for and what it is. And then we went through several different iterations of the subtitle, and that's what we landed on. And I'm so glad that she made that suggestion, because it really is a call to those of us who are in these identities and these fair-skinned bodies, because I believe that we have a certain opportunity to begin unpacking what that means. And we also have a responsibility to be accountable to the history here and the legacies that our ancestors left us. And we have a responsibility to undoing white supremacy as well. So I credit her with instigating that subtitle, and I'm really glad that it's on there.
I really love it. And the book looks beautiful. I can really wait to get mine. I did find an article called Kinship and Climate Justice, where you spoke about the colonial paradigm of control. Could you share a little more about what you mean when you use that term? What does that paradigm look like and feel like for those of us who are living in it? And when you then elaborate on kinship and how maybe a kin-centric approach to the earth and relationships differs from the colonial approach?
Yeah, I love this question so much, because there is a wonderful story behind this question that I want to share with you all. So that article was written a few years ago after I attended a meeting with the Forest Service here. So the mountain that's right here over my shoulder is Forest Service land. For many years, there has been a ski resort operating on this mountain. And in recent years, probably for the last decade or so, that ski resort has been manufacturing artificial snow out of reclaimed sewage water. Our city is leasing reclaimed sewage water to that ski resort to be made into snow. So you can imagine how egregious this is, how offensive and utterly insensitive this is, right? Because this is a sacred place. This would be like putting water from the toilet in the middle of your church. It's just unconscionable. So the reason that they're doing this is because climate change has made the ski season shorter, and they are trying to expand their profitability. So a few years ago, I was in a meeting with the Forest Service. There were several Indigenous elders in there, including medicine people, who presented to the members of the Forest Service, especially the forest supervisor who was present, because the issue on the table at the time was that the ski resort was wanting to expand and build a new ski lift to even further expand the business, and was seeking approval for this from the Forest Service. So we were all together in the same room. There were members of the Indigenous community-led group that I work with as a community organizer. There were these medicine people and elders, and there were members of the Forest Service present. The elders got up and prayed. They sang traditional songs. In some cases, they cried. In some cases, they told stories about the cultural significance of the mountain. And they implored the Forest Service not to approve the expansion on the ski lift. And I watched the Forest Service members, all of whom were white. I watched them. They were visibly moved. Many of them were crying. They were, it landed. They heard it, right? And when I watched that meeting, it was the first time I had ever been to a meeting like that. And I thought, oh my gosh, they're crying. They're moved. They heard it. And maybe this is going to make a difference. It didn't make a difference. They went ahead and approved it. And that was that. Well, at that point, I wrote that article. I received input from some of the people who were in the meeting, from some of the elders. We published it. The part of the story that's not been told is that the forest supervisor who was in charge at that meeting, we reached out to her, we meaning the Indigenous-led community group that I'm part of, we reached out to her and asked to sit with her. And she agreed. And the invitation included food, included a long, spacious time to sit together and eat and share stories. And we had several meetings like that with her, where we ate together, where we spoke, where we listened, where she explained where she's coming from, where she listened to us. And over the course of a couple years, she started pushing back on her superiors who were higher up in the Forest Service. And she started resisting and saying, no, we need to do tribal consultation, and we cannot move forward with these plans until the ski resort significantly modifies their plan based on the tribal consultation. And because of that, she was fired. So they put someone else in who would toe the line. But in that article, you know, there's a critique of her and her staff because they didn't listen. They allowed themselves to be moved, but they went ahead and did it anyway, right? But the most beautiful part of that story is that because we entered into relationship, because we entered into kinship, because we broke bread together, because we sat at the table together over months, it changed her. And she became the hero of that whole story. She became the hero. She's a hero to me because she took a huge hit in her career in order to stand up for what was right. So I don't think I've ever told that story outside of my own little community here. But to me, it's an inspiring story because it shows that, you know, change is possible through the process of relationship and eating together and listening to each other. And even though we're still fighting the expansion of the ski resort, it's still an issue that's not resolved. Each person who stands up with courage, each person who prioritizes relationship over profit makes a difference because we're changing the whole field around this issue.
That is an amazing story. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. And what a great illustration of the two paradigms and how they work themselves out in our society and in our world. Wow. It's interesting too that you mentioned the sharing food. We heard yesterday from one of our other presenters, Gopal Patel, said the first step for any relationship is to share food together, and you're doing that. It's really awesome. Something special happens when people gather around a table.
Mm-hmm.
In another article, Healing from Colonization on Thanksgiving and Beyond, you shared a really perceptive quote. And I want to read the quote and then ask you sort of a two-part question. You can stop me after the first question, or you can just take them both.
Okay.
But the quote I'm really interested in is, within white settler culture, our identities as settlers tend to be invisible to ourselves. We are entangled with systemic white supremacy and national mythologies designed to keep us comfortable and complicit. And many of us have developed multi-generational bubbles of denial and amnesia around the genocide and the broken treaties and the stolen land that enable us to stay. Our opportunity is to willingly pop those bubbles so that we can collectively decolonize and make the change. Just such an incredible image. Can you share how honest reflection or practices that you have engaged in enable those of us who are part of white settler identities to pop those bubbles? That's the first part of the question, I guess. How do we pop the bubbles? And then second, when the bubbles do pop and we begin to emerge, how do we practice that new way of seeing things and support decolonization? What actions can we do to repair the centuries of systems and culture that's rooted in colonization?
Yeah. Well, I can share that I lived here on this land for 20 years before my bubbles of denial began to pop. And they began to pop through friendships that I had with various women. Some of them women of color, some of them Indigenous women who had the incredible patience and generosity to sit with me, be friends with me, tell me stories, and help me to begin to see things differently. And it was shocking to me because in this community, we're right next to Navajo Nation and Hopi land, and it is possible to live in total segregation from the Indigenous communities for whom this is their land. This is their ancestral land. It is completely possible to be completely out of touch with them, completely ignorant about the history here, completely clueless. And I was. And so my bubbles of denial began to pop through friendship and relationship. And it was shocking. It was shocking because I heard stories that I had never heard before. Like, for example, stories about the Navajo Long Walk, when the Dene people were forced marched for hundreds of miles and sent to a concentration camp for 4 years. And when they were finally allowed to come back, they were given a very diminished slice of their ancestral homeland to inhabit on the reservation. And they were made to send their children to boarding school, where they were horrifically abused and neglected. So stories like that. I think, for example, I had heard about the Navajo Long Walk in graduate school, but it was very detached. It was a very detached clinical view of something that happened in the past. And it wasn't until I made friends with Dene people that I started to realize, oh no, this is still currently impacting them every single day, as well as, the environmental racism that's pulling resources out of their land and putting sewage on their sacred mountain, etc. So that is how I have been popping my bubbles of denial now for, 10 years, is by constantly putting myself in the relationships and the situations that will allow them to be popped. And then being very humble and willing to be uncomfortable, willing to hear the thing and keep my mouth shut and go home and sit with it and go, okay, I'm feeling a lot of shame about that. I'm feeling ashamed that I didn't know about that. I'm feeling ashamed that that has been invisible to me before. And I'm gonna work with it. So it's a largely internal process, I would say. It mostly happens in my own heart, in my own prayers, in my own home. It has also happened a lot for me on the land here. I've spent a lot of time sitting out on the land, walking around on the land, fasting on the land, etc. That's a great place to do this. It's not something that you want to do in a mixed race setting. That's not the place, in my opinion, to process popping our bubbles of denial. Because when we do that in a mixed setting, it can have unintended consequences. It's much more valuable to do it with other white people or by yourself or on the land. You can do it with your own ancestors too. I work with an ancestor altar almost every day. That's another way to do it. So that's kind of the how. And then what do you do once those bubbles are popping or have popped? You know, for me, I went through several years of being really super uncomfortable while my bubbles were popping often and frequently. And then after several of them had popped, it started to dawn on me, like from the inside, from the inside out, it started to dawn on me in a very deep way that reparations are needed, you know, and this looks different depending on the community. Reparations are, you know, different things are being asked for depending on the history, depending on the current situation. But that started bubbling up from within after I had sat with this very uncomfortable process for a few years. And I began making a personal reparations plan that I have been executing now for several years. And there's a guide that I put together that I think can be shared in the chat. If anyone would like to use that, you're welcome to. I co-facilitate groups of people to work through this process and make plans like this. And but it's just a tool that anyone can use. It's kind of a self-guided process, or you can do it with a friend. And it really has to do with being in touch with your own calling, what really interests you, what really lights you up, what really gives you a sense of optimism and hope. Those are the things that you can build into your reparations plan. And the way that I work with reparations plans is that they're living documents that are constantly evolving and changing, and you're working on them all the time, and you're rewriting them every 6 months or every year. You're working with a buddy who helps keep you accountable and helps you work through your blockages, because this is something that happens across the board when people do reparations plans, is that blockages come up. You know, there's guilt, there's shame, I'm never going to be able to do this right, so I'm going to be too busy to do it at all. All of these things come up, and it's normal. It's part of the process. And that's why we work with buddies, to help us keep going and work through those things as they come up, because it's just a normal part of the experience. Oh, Cindy, I can't hear you.
Sorry, I'm famous for my mute button. That's just really insightful, and it's helpful, I think, to hear you talk about the process of sitting with discomfort and feeling uncomfortable, and not instantly taking that to another community and asking for forgiveness, but to be able to sit with yourself and the shame of it. And it's interesting that it lasts years sometimes. Now, am I frozen? There we go.
Oh, there we go. Okay.
I was frozen in one of the bubbles, I'm afraid. I don't know how much you heard or the audience heard, but I was just interested that you talked about years of discomfort, and we're so into instant gratification and instant solutions when we feel discomfort or a problem. So, did you use journals? Could you can you tell us a little bit about how you were able to bear that discomfort and transform it over years?
Yeah, I mean, in large part, that's how my book was written, you know, because I had to have an outlet to process it. And also it's had a bazillion drafts because, the first, 10 times of writing it was not something that anybody should read, you know? But writing was very helpful for me. And, talking to my white friends and family, certain friends and family was very, very helpful. With other friends and family, they couldn't talk about it with me. I learned that as well, that a lot of times, when you begin this process and you try to share with white community, people want to shut that down. They don't want you to talk about it. They don't want to think about it themselves. It's almost taboo in white settler culture to talk about these things. It's considered rude and inappropriate by a lot of us. So I found the ones who I could talk to. And again, I can't emphasize enough. And I've worked with many elders who have asked me to emphasize this too. That sitting with the land. If there are herbs that are part of your ancestry or your spiritual tradition, flowers, but the land, there's something about the land that is calling us into this work. And the land is so supportive and so ready to help us move through this. The land is so old, so much bigger than all of us, so much wiser than all of us, right? So we can sit with her, we can sit with the water, and we can ask for help. We can honor the ancestors of the land where we live by making offerings. We can honor our own ancestors by making offerings to them. And we could just ask for help and listen. And that, I believe that if you do that as a committed practice over time of making an offering, asking for help, and listening, then things will start to come to you. And they will be uniquely tailored for you. I mean, I'm just sharing what's worked for me, but there will probably be other things for every single person on this call. Other instructions, you might receive dreams, you might receive insights, people might show up out of the blue to help you, etc. Things like that can happen because I think that this is part of a big movement that all of our ancestors and the land is calling us into right now.
That's really helpful. And it connects with something that we heard in an earlier presentation about how if we think our job is to save the earth, we're not recognizing that the earth is trying to save us and it's our help.
Yes.
So we had discussions earlier this week around white people connecting with their own indigenous roots and the lands from which we came. I think that you mentioned that you had traced your own ancestry back to your European and Celtic and Scandinavian roots. What kind of would you be able to share about how you explored those and what you gained from that process?
Oh my gosh, this is like one of my favorite topics. Yes. So, I've had a lot of Indigenous teachers. I'm very lucky that that's the case. And along the way, they started saying to me over and over, all of them, I heard it from all of them at one point or another. You need to go back and learn your own languages, your own songs, find out what happened to your people in Europe. And when they first started saying that to me, there was a huge wall of resistance inside. I was terrified to do that. I felt like it couldn't be done. There was no way. And I just had this irrational fear about doing it. But because of who they are and how much I respect them over time, I realized I do have to do that. I do. I've heard it so many times now that I have to do it. So I started I started reading books. Many of these are available on my website. There's a page on the website called, I think it's called Recovering European Ancestral Memory. So there are many books on there that I recommend. And I also started taking classes to learn old songs in Irish and Gaelic, which are two of the languages that my ancestors spoke. And there was something very subtle about it, very it took a long time to weave it and for me to see what was happening. But over time, I started to have this sense of like, oh, my people are with me. There's something about learning the old languages. You can also learn those languages or other ancestral languages on Duolingo. I highly recommend practicing an ancestral language and or learning old songs and definitely reading books. And the way that it works to restore ancestral memory, in my experience, is that it's not a research project. It's not like you're sitting down to write a paper and you have to get all your facts and figures straight. It's much more learning to listen in between the lines and read in between the lines and noticing how you feel. Sometimes I knew I was onto an important book for me when I would begin reading it, and within 3 pages, I would go to sleep because there's something about ancestral memory that makes it brings a sense of comfort and peace and sleepiness. And for me, it feels like being wrapped up in a blanket and just like held by a grandma, you know? So those are some of my tips on how to get there. And also, you know, there's something about, I think when I look back and I think, well, what was that resistance about? Why did I avoid doing that for so long? And I think that comes from many of our people in Europe were massively traumatized, massively. You look at the centuries of war, the centuries of patriarchal assault on the land and on the women. Many cultures were forcibly dispossessed of their land, forcibly dispossessed of their language and culture, assimilated into religions that were patriarchal. And whether we remember that or not, I think many of us are carrying around a sense of like, ooh, it hurts. It hurts that something happened to us. So, it's, that feeling can be there for some of us. And like popping bubbles of denial, we can move through it now. We're all safe now. We've got a place to live. Many of us, most of us, probably if we're on this call, we've all got a place to live. We've got water and food on the table, and we can move through it now. We can begin unraveling it now and unpacking it now and embracing our ancestral memory.
Hilary, thank you for such deep and insightful reflections with us today. I'm sure a lot of us are feeling very challenged and very inspired by what you've shared. There have been some questions I want to share from our audience that have come through on the chat. And the first one, I'm scrolling through again. The first one is, what types of personal and communal emotions come up as you think through reparations? What has been the cost to you as a result of popping white bubbles?
Yeah. I think the biggest blockage for me, the biggest cost, was the feeling of the debt is so massive, it can never be repaid. I will never be able to do this right. I will never be able to do enough. I descend from, people who received grants of stolen land and also who enslaved people. That's a huge debt, you know? How can I ever repay that? I can never figure this out. I don't know how to do it. That was probably the biggest blockage, or you could call it a cost for me. And, I talked through that with some friends, and over time I realized it's not my job to fix it. I can't fix it. And I also can't repay the debt. But what I can do is try to reduce the harm. And that is something that is within all of our grasp. We can all try to reduce the ongoing harm that is still unfolding as a result of colonization and slavery in this country. And the ironic thing is that, and I've heard this from many other people as well who have done their personal reparations plans, the ironic thing is that when you push through those blockages, those costs, those doubts, and you push through and you do it, you do whatever it is that is yours to do, then you're filled with joy and peace. So when I'm doing my reparations plan, it's not coming out of a sense of guilt or shame or even obligation. It's coming out of a sense of joy and love. And it brings me tremendous happiness to do it.
Thank you. This is from another audience member. I've heard you share about discovering your own family roots in the US and how you started to talk about that with your family. Can you speak to that journey for this audience?
Yeah, I I had kind of an interesting introduction into that because when this started for me, I wasn't curious about my ancestors at all. I didn't know anything about them. Some people grow up with that knowledge, and I didn't. My understanding of my family was that, it had to do with my mom's father's side, who were more recent immigrants from Northern Ireland. They were Protestants. They were very poor people. And so I grew up with that being the family identity that I knew of. It's like, we're poor, hardworking, bootstrapping people. And I had no idea about the other three lines of the family who had all been here since the 16 and 1700s. So, the doorway to learning about those other three lines came when I had some bizarre occurrences happening in my house. And I reached out to Yeye Louisa Tish, who is an elder and a chief, priestess of the Ifa tradition. And she said, your ancestors are trying to get in touch with you. And I built an altar based on instructions in her book, which is called Jambalaya. And pretty soon things started to happen. And within a couple of weeks, this book of family genealogy came to me. My mom gave it to me. It had been sitting on the shelf in the closet since the 90s. And I opened it up and learned that, sure enough, I had these ancestors who had received land grants and enslaved people. And on that side of the family, they had been here since 1739. And so that opening that book is what instigated all of this for me, because I couldn't deny it. It was right there. And, I didn't do a lot of other research in terms of like, where did everybody live and what did they do and when were they born and what are their names? I didn't do all that. It was that piece of information was enough for me to go, I think this is mine to deal with. Like, I think I need to do something about this because it hadn't been discussed in the family. It had never been talked about.
So interesting. Family secrets.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the thing is, for those of us who are white, this is the reality for many of us. Many of us. Like, a lot of us have got these skeletons in our closet, and I really think it's time to bring them out and shine the light of day on them and let that healing process begin.
Thank you. Here's another question from the chat. For those of us adopted or unable to figure out our family history, do you have recommendations on how we can connect with our ancestors or our ancestral memory?
Yes, absolutely. We do work with people who have been adopted in our circles, and it's basically a very similar process where you can set up a very simple ancestor altar in your home. It can be as simple as putting a candle and a glass of water down. You can make it more elaborate if you want to, but it can be very simple. And make offerings there, sing songs to them, introduce yourself to them, and ask them to help you. And then sit back and listen for what happens. In my experience, ancestral communication happens through very subtle channels. A lot of my communication has come through dreams. Sometimes it will literally be like you're walking through the library and it's like someone is pushing your head to look at this book on the shelf. And so you check out that book and take it home and read it. Sometimes it's like that. Sometimes people will show up who are somehow meant to help you or work together. But it's accessible to all of us. And these are practices that have been done all over the world by all the cultures. Many traditional cultures have honored and related to the ancestors in these ways. And so I believe it's accessible to all of us. And then was there another part to that question?
Connecting with our ancestors or ancestral memory was the other.
Right. Yeah. And then the other thing, if you feel comfortable getting a DNA test and you can find out where your people came from, that can be very helpful too, because if you find out they were from a certain part of the world, then that can be your guidepost to start looking for books and history from that part of the world. And exploring the mythology is very, very helpful to explore the mythology and the old stories. And maybe you can find old songs and old folk practices. All of that can be very helpful.
I love the idea of singing the old songs and letting them speak to you. Here's another great question. You shared the idea of kinship. Can you share more about what that word means and how it can shape our world?
Yeah. Kinship to me is it's developing the lens or the framework, the worldview of seeing each other as relatives. And, I like to imagine sometimes, like, if you think about the world or the United States even, imagine that we're all sitting at a big table together, right? And our seats at the table were determined before we were born. And we're each being served a meal. And some of us are being served, lobster bisque and prime rib. And some of us are being served contaminated water and nothing else. And some of us are being served a very simple meal that can give us nourishment, but that's not fancy. And all of us are here at this table together. And if you look to one side of the table or the other, you see these wide disparities, right? But the truth is, we're all family. We're all sitting at the family table together. We're all eating together. And if you were at that table, how would you feel about those who only had a bowl of contaminated water to drink? How would that impact your heart? Would that make you feel sad? Would that make you feel regret that maybe you have more? And if you look at the other end and everyone's overindulging and the food is dropping on the floor and it's excessive and the rats are coming to eat all the excess food, would you maybe, think, gee, hey, could you pass some of that down here? Could we all look at everybody down here who doesn't have anything to eat? So that's kind of a metaphor that I think of sometimes to really imagine and practice and enact. We really are all related. We're all sitting at the same table. We just have different portions and different things to eat. But, we can share and we can take care of each other. And that to me is what kinship is just, it's learning how to look out, like who's over here and how are they doing? Who's over here and how are they doing? And approaching them not as an enemy or as an other, but as a relative.
Thank you. Thanks again with the table. Here's a practical question. Do you have practical recommendations for those of us wanting to create relationships with Indigenous communities near us and to support their work, but don't know where to start?
Oh, yes. Yes. I mean, this is one of the most valuable things that we can be doing, in my opinion. And a good friend of mine and mentor and sister named Lila June Johnston, who wrote the closing words in my book, she taught me that what we can do is you can verbally ask the question, or you can sit with the question in your own mind of how, if at all, can I help? So if you can identify a Native-led organization or group in your community, and you can approach and ask that question either out loud or to yourself, and really listen to what they're asking for. I did this with my community, and it led to, taking part and becoming part of a group that has been working together for, I think, probably 8 or 9 years now. And, they are working on so many issues in the community, like policing and economic development and youth and homelessness and establishing an Indigenous community center in town. So many issues. So I asked if I could attend a meeting, and they said yes. And I sat there and I just listened for what was being asked for. So, on the very first meeting I attended, I was asked to take notes. So that means that I didn't say anything. I just took notes and sent them around. And then over time, I would be listening and I would hear, oh, we need a dinner. We need to come together and eat together. So I would host a dinner at my house. Or over time, I would hear, oh, they're asking me to go and speak to city council and talk about this issue. So I would do that. Or, oh, they're asking me to write an op-ed. So I would do that. The key is we can't be coming in there thinking we know best. And we can't even be coming in and saying, well, I'm really good at X, Y, and Z, so I want to do that. No, we need to show up in a steadfast way, in a humble way, and just listen for what is being asked for. And what's being asked for is often way different than what we think might be needed. And we just have to accept that. So to me, this is one of the most valuable things that we can be doing, because if you encounter a group like that and you are able to make relationships, and if you're welcomed, then everything will start to change. And it's the greatest teaching experience that you can have.
Thank you. That was really helpful to ask internally, how,
Right.
if at all, can I help?
Mm-hmm.
Very practical.
Yeah.
There has been a theme with speakers during the summit that sharing that the earth supports and guides us. And you have shared processing and being on and with the land and the way that you have been guided by the earth, by your mountain neighbor. For those of us who haven't practiced on the land or experienced that in our lives, can you share a few ideas for trying to experience that connection and receiving that guidance?
Yes. I would recommend starting with a place that is easily accessible to you. So it could be a tree or a rock or a river. It could be a certain corner of the park or a more wild place like what is next to me. And going to that place every day or almost every day, as much as you can, coming with a little offering, like a flower or a song, asking permission to sit with that place and listening. What do you hear? What is the place saying? Is it consenting to you sitting there, or does it want a little more time before you sit down? And following whatever you hear. And then if you're invited to sit there, you sit down on the ground. If you can take your shoes off and put your hands on the earth and just sit for maybe 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and listen. And make this a practice. It's kind of like in white culture, this is so antithetical to the way that we've been brought up, right? So it's a practice to work with our minds and get into that habit of listening to something that in the white way is considered inanimate, right? But is it inanimate or is it actually a being? So you can ask that kind of question. You can and listen and see what happens. But just making it very simple and easy to do every day is a really good way to start.
Thank you. Thank you. Our time is getting short, and I really hate for this conversation to end, but before we release you, I want to say this part of the conversation ends, but I know that other conversations are going to be sparked by this, and conversations around our family tables and with our natural surroundings and with a few trees, I hope. So it's really exciting. Thank you for getting us started on those conversations.
Oh, thank you, Cindy.
So much.
Yeah.
Wisdom. And with that, I will turn the microphone back to Aiden to finish us off.
Yeah, thank you, Cindy. And a huge thank you to Hilary for all that you shared, for guiding us through this important conversation. You can actually find links to pre-order Hilary's book, Becoming a Good Relative, Calling White Settlers Towards Truth, Healing, and Repair, and a guide to making a personal reparations plan in the chat. So as we bring this session to a close, I want to express my gratitude to all of you for being here and for your thoughtful engagement. Your questions and reflections are what make these conversations so meaningful. And I'd like to also encourage you to stay with us as we move forward into session 5 tomorrow, where Dr. Melanie Harris will lead us in a conversation about ecofeminism, exploring the intersections of race, spirituality, and environmental justice. It's sure to be a deeply enriching session. And finally, don't forget about our bonus session on Thursday, September 26th, focused on Faith in Place's Tree Canopy and Workforce Community Grant Opportunity. If you're in Illinois, Indiana, or Wisconsin and represent a house of worship or 501c3 organization in an environmental justice community, you won't want to miss this chance to learn how your organization could receive up to $30,000 for tree planting and maintenance projects. As a reminder, you can join us on Hilo, our event networking platform, to keep the discussion going and connect with others in your area. The link to sign up is in the chat. The slides, recording, and resources for all the summit sessions will be emailed out next week and available on our summit website. We also invite you to complete our summit survey for a chance to win a $50 gift card after you join the last session you are able to be part of. You can find the link in the chat and it will be emailed out as well. Thank you again for being part of this journey with us, and I look forward to continuing this important work together. Have a wonderful rest of your day, everyone. Thank you so much.